Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third installment of Northeastern University's Innovation Imperative Series. Feel free to tweet during the event using the hashtag #EdOutcomes. Please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Northeastern President Joseph E. Aoun.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today. As some of you know, this is the third survey we do. The first survey was a survey of the general public and especially focusing on the 18 to 25. The second was focused on the HR heads. And what we are trying to do today is we surveyed the CEOs all over the country. And the purpose is very simple. What we wanted to do every time is to understand what our customers, and in higher education the term of customer is not a term we like. But we looked at customers, whether we are talking about the students or we are talking about the employers or we are talking about the CEOs, and we wanted to understand how they view us and how we are positioning ourselves in higher education with respect to their expectations, to their demands, and to their needs. We will have the opportunity to discuss the findings in detail, but let me mention that this is the first time we are releasing the survey in Boston. We did it in Washington, we did it with the Brookings, but today we said, look, let's do it here in our own home. And this wouldn't have been possible without the collaboration with the New England Council and WGBH. And what we wanted to do is not only release a national survey, but also focus on how Boston fits with this national survey or doesn't fit. So without further ado, what I want you to do is just relax, tweet as much as you want, and everything you say is going to be live. So you cannot be anonymous here. Welcome.
Good morning. My name is Jim Brett. Happy to be a sponsor of this morning's event with the New England Council. Needless to say, it's a pleasure to see so many of our members of the New England Council joining us here this morning. For those of you who may not be familiar with the New England Council, we are the nation's oldest regional business organization. We bring together the region's business community and the higher ed institutions to advance public policies that promote economic growth here in New England. And among the New England Council's top priorities is sustaining and growing the New England region as a global center of innovation. So when we heard that today's poll and discussion were going to center on what business leaders want from higher education in order to ensure their future competitiveness, it truly was a match for us to participate. And many of you know that the New England Council works very closely with the New England Congressional Delegation and other federal policy makers to shape the policies that impact the New England region. And I have no doubt that the poll being released today will be incredibly useful in informing our leaders in Washington about some of the challenges that we face in promoting innovation in the region. Needless to say, we are thrilled to be associated with Northeastern University, a longtime member of the New England Council, which in recent years has become one of the Council's leading voice for investment in research, innovation, education. And one of the reasons is because we have a higher ed committee, and it's chaired by our co-chair, Tim Leshin, from Northeastern University, who does an outstanding job for the New England Council. I know he does an outstanding job for Northeastern University, and we're grateful that the President has allowed Tim to spend the time that he does for the New England Council. Tim always says, have all the time in the world, no problem, but very fortunate to have him. So I just want to congratulate Northeastern University. This co-op program that you may be hearing more about, we, the New England Council, have employed 17 co-ops in the last several years, and many of them have gone on to work full-time for the New England Council and other businesses here in the New England region. So we are a huge supporter of the co-op program that Northeastern University has developed. We're delighted to partner also with WGBH, which for many years has been an acclaimed public media leader in our region. So we're grateful and appreciative of Northeastern University's support, and we appreciate them being very thoughtful and including the New England Council in today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Morning, everybody. My name is Jocelyn Landau. I'm from FTI Consulting. I was one of the people that worked on the poll that you'll be hearing more about in a few minutes. But for now, we wanted to ask you a couple of questions, and these are questions that we asked business executives and C-suite leaders as well. This might be the only time that we're asking you to take out and use your phone, because you'll be able to text or tweet your responses to the keywords that you see on the screen here. So the first question, and this is a question that we asked the business executives in our poll: what was the most important determining factor in your own career success? The way you can respond is by either texting your keyword to 22333 or by tweeting it at poll space and then the keyword. And as you can see, responses are starting to tally up, so please go ahead and submit your response, whether it's education, mentorship, advising, internship, or your own personal drive and ambition. Looks like we're starting to tally up a few different responses, with internships leading the way for now. And it'll be interesting to see how these results compare to our poll results that you'll be hearing about next. Any last votes? Kind of final answers? Looks like, we're switching over to, interesting. We have a bit of a jump here. You're making my job a little harder. Education internships are kind of, and drive and ambition are competing there. So that's interesting. Looks like there's not a unanimous vote on this one. We'll be asking you one last question now. And again, please feel free to text or tweet your answers to this next question that we'll be adding to the screen momentarily. Here we go. The next question is, compared to today, what do you think will happen with the value of a college degree in the next 10 to 15 years? Do you think the value of a college degree will increase in value, decrease, or stay the same in the next 10 to 15 years? And again, if you think increase, please text or tweet NU11. If you think decrease, NU22. And if you think it'll stay the same, use the code NU33. Glad we have a very tech-savvy audience, because already everybody's off to the races texting and tweeting their answers. And again, this is a question we asked in our survey, and you'll be seeing the results of that as well momentarily from our C-suite audience. So far, interestingly, we have about 50% saying increase in value, and a good minority, 35%, are saying decrease in value, and about 20% saying stay the same. So again, not necessarily a unanimous vote, but slight favor to optimism. So that's a nice way to start the morning. And without further ado, I'll be introducing my boss, Ed Riley. He's the Global CEO of Strategic Communications at FTI Consulting, and he'll be walking through our poll results for you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you all for coming out so early this morning, and a special thanks to President Aoun for sponsoring this work that we've done over the last 3 years and contributing to the public debate about where we're going in public education, higher education. I'd also like to thank the New England Council and WGBH for sponsoring our event this morning. For those of you who might be interested, all three surveys are hosted on the Northeastern University website. So if you are interested in going back and looking at what we've done over the last 3 years, northeastern.edu/innovation survey is where you can find all the material. And so with that, my job is to do a quick tour across the treetops of this survey that will hopefully inform a little bit of the discussion and interest a little bit of all of you in the debate that we continue to have about higher education and where it goes. President Aoun mentioned when he came up here the previous two surveys that we've done where we have oversampled in our first survey young people coming into the labor force who had just recently come out of the higher education experience. We oversampled them. We national sample, oversampled young people. The next survey we did in 2013, we oversampled those, a national survey, and then oversampled people in the workplace that were making hiring decisions. So in each of those two surveys, I'll refer to them a little bit. If I refer to 2012, general public, oversample with young people, 2013, general public, oversample of HR professionals who are involved in hiring. In this survey, a very different sample, we focus on business leadership. So we have 800 individuals who we surveyed nationally, and I would say in this third survey, this poll examines the current views on college student outcomes, graduates' preparedness for the workforce, and innovation in higher education, as well as the impact of the recession on people's business decisions during that period of time. The national sample, that which is representative of this business constituency, is 502 and is a proportional representation of business, with supplemental samples in designated markets of Boston, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Seattle, Washington. So from time to time I will talk about those smaller subsamples. The poll was conducted February 3rd through 9th. The overall incidence was 75%. The margin of error is about 4.37% plus or minus on the national survey and 5.6 on the oversample. And we have a 95% confidence factor on the findings here. Just quickly, key findings. Most business leaders believe that the U.S. education system lags behind both the developed and emerging markets in preparing students for the workplace. And virtually all steadfastly believe innovation is crucial to remaining globally competitive. The employee skills gap is real, and people believe that it might worsen. Business leaders resolutely believe there is a skills gap in today's U.S. workforce, and a substantial majority contend that most college graduates lack the important skills needed to succeed. Interestingly, in talking in the survey, if you were to go look at that, they focus on the softer skills also, the ability to communicate, the ability to work within a team as being more important than technical skills. So again, of this business audience, that was where the focus was. American business leaders are divided on their expectations of whether college graduates will be more or less prepared for the workforce in 10 to 15 years looking forward. Nearly two-thirds of C-suite executives say the Great Recession has impacted their business, the most common consequence being a reduction in the number of entry-level positions, and also in the Boston area, recruitment on college campuses, suspending that during the recession. And finally, higher education, people believe, must develop innovative ways to educate and prepare students. C-suite executives resolutely believe that colleges and universities should expand opportunities for experiential learning and teaching about entrepreneurship. The sense that people do not have the necessary experience or have not been taught the basics about entrepreneurship is something that business leaders focus on. So just in terms of some quick selected findings to talk about from the survey, we asked respondents thinking about emerging economies such as China, India, Brazil, and the more mature economies such as Japan and Europe. How do you think the U.S. ranks in terms of preparing students for the workplace? 54% in this survey of business leadership say that we are behind most or behind all. Only 43% saying that we are ahead. That matches up dead on with our national survey in 2014 of the general public. We then asked business executives, Please indicate whether you agree or disagree with the following: that the U.S. higher education system needs to remain innovative in order to remain competitive with other countries around the world. The issue of innovation, overwhelmingly, I mean, you know, near unanimous. 96% of those in the C-suite say that innovation is absolutely critical, which also matches up with slightly lesser but also overwhelmingly supportive, 87% in our 2013 sample, 83% in our 2012 sample of the general public. And in the next 10 to 15 years, we asked, do you think college graduates in this country will be more prepared, less prepared, or equally prepared to enter the workforce as compared to today's graduates? Again, 27% saying more prepared, 32% saying less prepared, 39% seeing no change. An interesting difference as you look at companies that have less than 100 employees versus those that have more than 100. Small business, much more concerned you know, about students being less prepared than companies with larger employee bases of greater than 100 employees. 43% of those employers with greater than 100 employees believe that students will be more prepared. Only 19% saying less prepared. So a substantially different look of those that are smaller companies, potentially startup companies, potentially companies that are finding themselves on the cutting edge, being a little more concerned about that issue. We then asked, do you expect that the value of the college degree in America will increase, decrease, or stay the same? As we all know, there's been a fair amount of debate in our earlier surveys, delved into the issue a little more about the value of higher education. What we see here is that 33% say that the value will increase, 38% saying that it will stay the same. So 71% saying that it will increase or stay the same. Relatively positive rating. I'd also note that in Boston, 38% believe that the value would increase. So again, one of the things that we found here in Boston as a subsample is a slightly higher alignment between business and what they see as the product coming out of higher education at this point. And just a little bit about this question on the skills gap. Do you think there is currently a skills gap or shortage of necessary skills among the U.S. workforce? 73% saying yes. A little different cut as you look at the manufacturing sector at 86 being the highest, professional services 77, healthcare and social services at 67%, saying that there is a concern. In asking our respondents, you know, what are the top 10 skills that are necessary, what would you see as the single most important skill or capability for a recent college graduate to possess? The number one answer was communication skills, followed by interpersonal skills, networking, socialization, ability to work in teams. So that what some might describe as the softer skills scoring higher than technology, computer skills, which was down at 5%. So interestingly enough, among this business leadership audience, what we find is that there's a real sense that some of what we might describe as the softer skills being lacking in today's graduates. We then asked about the long-term impact of funding cuts on the quality of the workforce. Overall, how concerned are you that cuts in government funding for higher education and research will have a negative and long-term impact on the quality of the U.S. workforce? 76% of the national sample saying that they were concerned, a lesser amount, 60% in Boston. We're sort of theorizing that this might be a little bit about the strong private institutions that exist here in the Boston area, might lead to a little bit of that differential, but still in both instances overwhelming concern, a majority of concern about a lack of funding having lasting impacts on the quality of the workforce. And then a little bit about the recession. You know, in all of the public research that we've been doing since the events of late 2008 and 2009, there has been substantial dislocation in the American economy, particularly middle-class families hit very hard by this. We asked this question: please indicate which, if any, of the following describes the impact of the Great Recession on your company. Again, this is a business leadership audience. 40% saying that they reduced entry-level positions. 31% slowed promotion tracks for existing employees. 29% invested less money and resources in employee training and education programs. And then 17% we stopped or reduced recruiting on college campuses. In the Boston subsample, that was at 30%. So again, you see a real impact on those getting onto the escalator. The slowing of promotions, the slowing of recruitment, and the slowing of entry-level positions being filled because of the recession. And then a little bit about, during this period of time, online higher education. And we've been tracking this issue in all of the 3 surveys that we've done. That's a sort of dynamic area where the numbers are bouncing around from time to time. We asked people, an online college degree provides a similar quality of education as compared to traditional colleges or universities. And in this, we see that basically we are evenly divided in assessing the quality, with 48% saying they either strongly agree or agree with that statement, and 48% saying that they disagree or strongly disagree with that statement. So there is a real divide on this, and that has been something that we've seen in the survey. Interestingly, in the Seattle market, there was great acceptance for online education. So this has some regional differences as we go around the country also. But then, asking the question, my company would consider hiring an employee that received an online degree or certification from a non-university course provider. 69% strongly agreed that they would look at and consider hiring an employee with those types of credentials rather than the traditional higher education credentials. So, again, in our previous survey work looking at value, how people assess value of the traditional 4-year residential experience versus some of the alternatives that are popping up, we see that there's sort of a divided front on that, but we do see increasingly that employers are willing to look at this credentialing as being appropriate for their workplace. And then we asked, please indicate how important you think each of the following is for U.S. colleges and universities to focus on. Integrating education programs with practical experience, such as internships with employers. Again, we find that this practical experience issue, the issue of experiential learning, is something that employers are really focused on as creating an employee, particularly an entry-level employee, that comes to them with a greater level of preparation. So 97% saying that this is very important or somewhat important. When we asked the same question of our general population surveys in 2012 and 2013, they were respectively at 77% and 79%. So broad consensus that this is a very important piece, from business leadership to the general public to hiring professionals at HR to the young who are entering the labor force, that cohort that we oversampled in 2012. So a broad consensus around this issue. We then asked about, partnerships with educational institutions. While everyone agrees, most don't participate. So what we would say is that many colleges and universities partner with private industry. Which of the following would you say is the most beneficial type of partnership for your organization? Again, this is of a business leader that we're asking this. Number 1 and 2 at 36%, therefore 7 and 10, saying long-term internships for college students to give them that experiential learning. And education partnerships focused on specialized skills and training, skills that are very relevant to the business leader as they go into the marketplace. They find these things very important. And again, what we then followed on is asked, and is this type of program currently underway at your company? 44% said yes, 54% said no. So while there's a widespread recognition of the value of this, it is a little less even in terms of the participation. We then asked, please indicate how important you think each of the following is for U.S. colleges and universities to focus. And this is the importance of the entrepreneurship programs. 89% cite entrepreneurship and learning basic business skills as being a very important skill for people coming out of their 4-year college experience, or those who are entering the workforce from another point of entry. Again, looking back at the general public survey, 70% agree with the same statement. So this notion of the entrepreneurial experience, the business experience, there's broad consensus on this point that this would be very important in terms of the education experience. And then finally, please indicate which, if any, of the following are currently offered at your company in terms of training and education. Funding for employees to take online continuing education courses. We sort of contrasted this, the national sample to Boston, 33% saying that they are participating in that. Funding for employees to take in-person continuing education courses, 38%. In both of those you see substantial uptick in the Boston subsample. And then professional development and training within the workplace. 41% of the national sample said that they were funding those types of activities. 62% in Boston said that they were doing that. And then the question that we asked all of you to participate in, which of the following was the most important factor in your own career success? We asked of business respondents, and please select the top two boxes. Personal drive and ambition, 72%, early career training, 31%, and then college or graduate education, 27%, and mentors or advisors, 27%. Interestingly, in Boston, 45%. A substantial difference from the sample as a whole, talked about mentors or advisors. And again, that may well be part of the sort of the nature of the opportunity and workforce here, the businesses that are here, but mentorship and that type of counseling to employees entering the labor force identified as being a very, very important skill set, and very important in terms of individuals' own career path and success as they look back from their leadership position now. So that is a quick tour of the survey results, and I'd invite you all to go back and look at the previous work that we've done. I think that Northeastern wants to use this to help to inform and contribute to the debate about public higher education. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kara Miller, host of WGBH Radio's Innovation Hub.
Yeah, no, anyway, fine. So thanks for coming, and we're going to have a panel discussion about these results, what to make of them, how do you make higher education better and make the people who are coming out of the higher education system more ready for the kind of workforce that is being created right now. And then we're going to take your questions, so be thinking as we do this discussion whether you have questions for the panel. So let me introduce Jeff Selingo. He's a contributing writer for the Chronicle of Higher Education, contributing editor. He's also the author of College Unbound and has written a ton about the future of higher education and where it's going. Gary Gottlieb is the president and CEO of Partners Healthcare, which is the largest employer in Massachusetts, so a good perspective on this. He's also a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and the chairman of the Private Industry Council. And President Joseph Aoun, who you heard from, is the president of Northeastern University, which is well known for their co-op program, so we'll be able to talk about that sort of integration of real-world experience and classroom experience. And Jeff Selingo, I'm going to start with you. You know, people have worried for a long time. You see this with the current debate over Common Core about K through 12. But for a long time, people have said, well, you know, even in the whole world, the jewel, you know, of higher education is the U.S., right? We may have trouble K through 12, but our higher education system, anybody would want that higher education system. Do you feel like when you talk to people in higher education and outside higher education, the kind of concern that's existed for a long time about K through 12 education is creeping into that higher education system?
Well, there's no doubt about it, it's creeping in on the outside of higher ed. I still don't think most in higher ed have kind of accepted where higher ed is going and the worries. And I also think that we tend to talk about higher ed as a big system, and it's really an accumulation of many systems. And I think at the very top, people around the world still want to come here. What's interesting about the survey, it would be interesting to see when people say higher education, what type of institutions they mean. Because if you look especially at foreign enrollment at U.S. institutions, at many institutions it's been growing and growing for a while, and there's more demand than ever before for students to come here. So I think we're mostly talking about the vast majority of institutions in this country, and I think that the public is increasingly wondering about the value of a college degree when, something like 18% of last year's graduates are unemployed, and nearly 50%, and the interesting finding from the poll about entry-level jobs, 50% of last year's graduates are underemployed, meaning that they're basically in jobs that don't require bachelor's degrees. So if you're a parent who just paid X number of dollars to send your son or daughter to college, that's why I think the value of higher education is being questioned more and more.
Gary Gottlieb, let me bring that to you. From the employer side, do you notice a bifurcation between, these people that we just employed graduated from elite institutions, they're doing really well, and these people didn't, and they're having more trouble? Like, do you notice the bifurcation in the quality of higher education, maybe because of funding or whatever else?
I don't think that we could distinguish that bifurcation that well. I think that we've had a long experience in working with higher education, particularly on the professional side, and we are a training and set of academic institutions ourselves. So there's a high degree of intimacy, both with understanding where people have been at the undergraduate level as well as their graduate schools before they then enter into whatever kinds of training programs we have and that relate to them. I think that we have, as employers, not done the greatest job in informing higher education as to what our needs are and created clear pathways and partnerships to identify the specific skills that we need now and the skills that we project that we will need over a period of time. We're living in a very, very slow recovery in which the employment base has changed pretty remarkably. Long-term unemployment is very, very high, and the size of the workforce has in fact shrunken. So it is no surprise that people at the entry level, even those who have skills, would not be able to immediately employ them because the overall denominator has shrunken in a significant way, and we haven't retooled the economy. And for us to blame that specifically on higher education would be not to see the whole picture. I certainly haven't seen a bifurcation among the pathways, but at the same time, I do believe that we need to create partnerships to better inform both sets, those who have been elite and those that are evolving in the marketplace, to be able to fit what we expect to be workplace needs.
When you hear that number, that kind of overwhelming number of 87% of employers think, look, people are not up to the skill level that we need them to be up to. Do you take that as this is a really serious acute problem, or do you take that as, well, look, I mean, we hardly can hire anybody, right? There's this huge pool of people out there. Or do you take it as people always have been dissatisfied with what's out there?
I take it as a very big threat to the long-term infrastructure of this country. Those skills and human capital are by far the most important distinguishing feature in the long-term economic success of any country, and this one in particular. It just means that we need to work from all sectors to be able to build the right pathways, from making certain that secondary education is adequately preparing people to enter into higher education and to be able to obtain the skills that we describe, and that we're providing the appropriate set of venues. Just to say that we have internships and not creating accountability on the mentorship side as to what it is that we want people to be able to learn is foolishly casting off onto a different sector the overall responsibility.
President Aoun, it sounds like that 87% of employers that say there's a serious skills gap here when it comes to what people are coming out of higher ed with and what we need for the workplace. It sounds like, I mean, according to Gary, that's a real threat to businesses. Do you feel that too, that something here has shifted and that skills gap is a real problem?
I think I completely agree with Gary. There is a real threat to businesses, but also there is a real threat to higher education. Because in many ways, we got away for 150 years by being closed to the real world. And we had a wake-up call with the recession, because suddenly the graduates woke up and said, well, I'm investing a lot in higher education. What is the value? What I'm getting in return? And so if you look at it from the point of view of the students or the employers, it's the same thing. You know, ultimately, we have to prepare them not only for the first job, but for life. And therefore, we have created a kind of dichotomy over the years in higher education between being, you know, the liberal arts and being ready for the real world. And this dichotomy is something that we got away with because, frankly, we concocted that in our classrooms and in our own setting. We try to clone ourselves. We try to clone ourselves, and frankly, today this doesn't exist anymore. We cannot survive in this way. So it's a wake-up call for all of us. We cannot castigate any part of higher education. It's an opportunity. That's where we are.
Well, I think if you just think about the bachelor's degree, it's really being overworked today. Because, you know, 40 years ago, when we expected fewer people to go to college, because there were many more opportunities, particularly for high school graduates, we thought of the bachelor's degree kind of as a vehicle for broad learning, right? And you would get the specific training either in graduate school or on the job. And now, those two things, kind of the broad learning and training, work in tandem. And we also expect experiential learning, internships, study abroad, throw all that in. Oh, and by the way, many students are coming to college now not prepared to do college-level work, so we have to do remedial education at the same time. And there's this incredible pressure at the state level and at the national level to do all this in 4 years. So we've stuffed all these requirements and all these expectations on the bachelor's degree to do it in 4 years. We expect students to go at 18 and at 22, even though we're living a lot longer throughout our lifetimes. We're going to work a lot longer. We're going to move through multiple careers. And yet we still think of the bachelor's degree as the thing that should do it all.
Well, actually, we're now demanding people do it in 3 years.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's kind of interesting when you look at the survey data. We as employers expect actually and value most communication skills, social skills, and working in groups. And yet somehow we say that the American higher education system is failing relative to those emerging countries. I've seen no data to suggest that China and Brazil are creating extraordinary social skills or communication skills. It's highly specific technical skills that we covet related to very specific jobs, whether in precision manufacturing, technical skills related to science, or other components that we value in other countries. And we see that only in a very, very small slice of the population, particularly in those two countries, that have access to those kinds of resources. And if we're valuing these other set of skills, yet somehow devaluing our institutions that in fact may have greater strengths in those areas, we better be clear as employers and as a society as to what our expectations are, so that the bachelor's and the ensuing degrees have a set of credentials and skills that are reinforced relative to the real-life skills we're expecting.
You know, I tried to understand why is it the case that the employers are saying that we're falling behind. In fact, in many ways, higher education in the United States is a destination. That's one of the two premier export industries in the nation. Entertainment being the first and education being the second. And if you look at us, we don't do in general in higher education a good job educating global citizens. The world knows about us more than we know about them. Why? Because we're the superpower. So we send 500,000 students approximately every year overseas, and we have millions of students studying. So we are not globally competent from this perspective. And then when you look at the competition, whether it's in China or Singapore, in Europe, etc., they understand their culture and they understand our culture. They are bilingual. They can work in multiple settings. So from this perspective, you know, that's an opportunity for us to become much more global. And we are not doing that in higher education. Some companies, like for instance GE, made a statement that by the age of 26, you are not globally proficient. Even if you're a great employee, we're not going to promote you. We're not going to advance you. So that's a wake-up call for us in higher education, too.
It's interesting, though, because I want to go back to those skills. You know, here's a skills gap. And then you say, okay, well, what skills do you want? Communication, working in teams. I mean, I have to say, as somebody who has taught English at the college level, it may be a soft skill to learn how to write, but it's very hard to teach. And it is not, you know, as easy to get people to be good writers as you would wish it would be. But it's interesting that I mean, people didn't say, well, I'd like them to know HTML. I'd like them to know accounting. No, maybe that's because there's only little slivers of the economy where those things are important, and so they couldn't win out. But I guess I wonder about those skills and that teamwork, because, I mean, if you look at, like, the hiring that's going on in Kendall Square, you're not going to get hired just because you can work on a team and communicate, even though those are really important things.
Well, and I think that's the difference between asking CEOs these questions and asking the people who do the day-to-day hiring. Because we always think, well, what do employers want? And every college out there is chasing what employers want. But the problem is, even within specific companies, the CEO, who rarely hires anybody, especially entry-level jobs, says, well, we want these broad, essentially liberal arts skills. But if you look at the day-to-day hiring practices, even of that company, that's not necessarily what they're following. And if you look at books like Peter Capelli's, why people don't get, or why people don't get good jobs, or why good people don't get jobs, he talks about basically, human resources has been outsourced to a computer, where you're looking for keywords, and they're looking for many of these jobs, keywords like HTML skills or specific degrees in sustainability or whatever. They're not looking for the person who has an English degree who might be able to do a lot of things. So I think that's part of the problem with trying to decide what employers want, because I think even within a company, you probably can answer this better.
And within a company, one looks at the areas that are hardest to hire, the areas where there's the most fear of shortage, and where there's expectation for growth over a period of time. So if I look across partners with 60-some-odd thousand employees, we're doing a large IT project, and healthcare IT is a major driver of being able to support decision-making, give us data to be able to make decisions, be able to improve the quality of care. There is a tremendous shortage in people doing healthcare IT, either at the technical and installation level or programming, or in other critical components. At the same time, if I look at the long-term view of providing care, there's a tremendous shortage in nursing in the long term. The nursing workforce is aging, but that's lost my attention because since the recession, the overall day-to-day shortages of nursing has dissipated. So now, after we tried to work with higher education to create pathways in nursing and a variety of the other key professional areas, those people are finding themselves competing for jobs or not having the flexibility that they thought they were going to have because there's a latency before those real shortages will occur because of the demographic, and because of our lack of growth and the changes in external features, we're not hiring like Topsy as we did before. So now we've confused them. We've got a group of people, and for a while, because we were so interested, we said we'll take nurses with 2-year degrees. Now, of course, we want nurses with 9-year degrees. So essentially, we're imbalanced in the way that we're providing real data to inform this process in the pipelines.
Let me add something here and go back to what Jeff said. We should expect a learner, by the time she leaves the university, to have it all, to have the skills and the soft skills. Now, let me pick a little bit on the survey that we did in the morning, especially with Jocelyn, when she said, what's more important, education or internship, experiential education? And frankly, an internship are meaningless unless they are integrated in an educational approach. So in order to learn, you integrate the classroom experience with the world experience. And through that, you get not only your hard skills, but also your soft skills. Let me quote my friend Gary. In the morning he told me, look, I can see through the rotation if a nurse or a doctor or whatever is going to make it. Because through their internships, I see whether they are going to be able to have the teamwork, whether they are going to be have the human factor as predominant, etc. That's education. Education is bringing the two together, not pitting one against the other. Therefore, going back to the point that Jeff made, yes, we are seeing that higher education is shrinking the number of years. Students want to get out in 3 years, in 3.5, in 2.5, and therefore, how are you going to give them the opportunity to bring the two together? And that's where models that integrate the two have to be pushed forward.
So do you think it's reasonable to do all that we're trying to do in 4 years, even?
Listen, from a knowledge perspective, by the time a student leaves campus, her knowledge, half of her knowledge is obsolete. We don't tell them that, and we don't tell them, and we don't tell them which half, refund, right? And we don't tell them which half. They, otherwise we'll be out of business. But, no, but on a more serious note.
So they can become CEOs.
They can become CEOs, absolutely.
About 80%.
Yeah. So from this perspective, it's not an accumulation; it's the integration. Mm-hmm. So rather than going for stacking, how can we integrate the two aspects of what we do? And every university has some form of that. And that's the real opportunity.
I mean, without doing a marketing piece for Northeastern, that is the magnificence of a 100-year-old co-op program. And, when I describe what we were doing, in professional education in medicine, for years and years, we've integrated a real-life apprenticeship in every aspect of education, whether it's in nursing education, physical therapist, or in medical school. I mean, the last 2 years are entirely clinical, and you can pretty much predict who is going to be able to have a harder time in residency programs or in being a genuine physician from the second or third rotation in terms of being with a team, being able to listen to patients, being able to demonstrate genuine empathy and integrate, as you described. The notion of just throwing internships as experiential learning into the marketplace because we have an economy that's not recovering adequately and we want to try to give somebody a proxy for experience is very, very difficult because we as mentors are not truly accountable in that structure. There isn't an integration in the work that we're doing with the knowledge that people are receiving in whatever other classroom experiences that they're having, and it isn't being reinforced so that those social skills beyond those which they either have because of nature and nurture in their own home or other experiences can flower in a way in which they're real in the workplace. And that's a critical feature of, I think, what those executives are talking about.
Jeff, I want to ask you, what do you see in terms of colleges and employers being willing to partner? Certainly from the employer point of view, and you can say more about this, Gary, but from the employer point of view, it can be hard to have people in your workplace, right, who don't know what it is they're doing, and people have to take time away. The people who do know what they're doing have to take time away from what they're doing to make sure those people know the ropes, and after an hour or two they come back and say, now what do I do, right? And you saw that in the data. People are like, this is a great idea. Go do an internship. Go find real-world experience. Do you do it? No, we don't do that in our company. It's like, probably they would say, we don't have time for that.
Well, it's hard to scale, right?
Right.
So, you have to give these students real experiences, and especially increasing experiences as they get older and go through school. And I think that for most employers, I always wonder why other institutions have not followed Northeastern's model in terms of the co-op model. But even if they could, you wonder if the employment system, if the economy could take in all of those students coming into the system and give them real work. And that's what worries me. It also worries me that are these internships and these co-ops replacing full-time jobs? I'm really worried about how these recent graduates are really struggling to launch. If you see work by Tony Carnevale, who's an economist at Georgetown, he came out with a report a couple of months ago called Struggling to Launch. And in that, he talked about the average age of financial independence for today's college graduates is 30. So you essentially have lost an entire decade now. Because in the early 80s, it was about 25, 26. And we've essentially lost an entire decade for these young students. And I think that colleges really have a responsibility now that goes beyond commencement day to help students launch into their careers and get on that escalator.
Yeah. Over that time period, what's the actual individual debt service simultaneously?
Yep.
So if you add to that, how do you even define financial independence? Because somebody is leaving college with a mortgage.
So he's defining it as median when they've reached essentially the median income.
Right, but they still, if they're carrying that debt service,
exactly. That's
simultaneously the actual expendability of that income is diminished.
Let me share something about internships here, which is very telling, and it was also very interesting for us. Many employers told us that they stopped the summer internships because, the students go there for the first month, they get trained, the second month they leave. So, and that's essentially what happened. So they stopped that. And during the recession, we were extremely worried because we have 3,000 employers and, in 114 countries. And we were extremely worried that it's going to hit us. In fact, we saw that the number of co-ops or long-term internships increased. So we wanted to understand why. So I went and I visited many CEOs, nationwide and worldwide through the multinationals. So I asked, why is it the case that this is happening? They said, look, we cannot afford not to have a pipeline of talent. So they're not looking at the interns as a favor that they are doing to the university or to the students. It's a pipeline for talent. Even places that were laying off people, going back to your point, Jeff, they kept using and going for internships, long-term internships. So the net result is that these long-term internships increased nationwide rather than decreased. And going back to the entry level, the survey mentioned that the entry-level jobs are disappearing. Why? Because you have the entry level is happening at a level way before they graduate. And by the time they graduate, they have jobs. So that's what's interesting, and that's what's happening. But if you leave your college without having those possibilities, in a way, it's very difficult because they excised already the first entry level.
You're already behind.
They're already behind. And that's interesting.
So if, President Obama called you into his office and said, I think it might be interesting to try to scale this Northeastern thing up and see if you could spread it around all different colleges and universities all over the country. And, forget having 3,000 employers. We want 20,000. I mean, we really want it to be big. Would you say to him, oh, I think I could do it? Or would you say, I think that's going to be, you're going to encounter some serious resistance when you go, I can try to do it, but go around, try to talk to employees, this is going to be hard.
Well, the Department of Education, Secretary Duncan and the Undersecretary talked to us and are now talking to us about that. So let me tell you, from a parochial perspective, our differentiation will be in jeopardy because what we do, everybody will do, by definition. So from the other aspect that you raised, what are the barriers to entry? Or going back to what Jeff said, why isn't the case that everybody does it? Because ultimately, it's tough to think about integrating the world experience with the classroom experience. We as faculty, we were trained to ignore, the reality and to reconstruct the reality and to think about it, which is very valuable. But now we have to put up with reality. And therefore, that's a barrier to entry. Yes, it can be done. Yes, it should be done. And frankly, it should be done at a global level. People are interested in competence at a global level.
I mean, I think one of the points here, too, is that if you talk to faculty on many campuses, not all, but many campuses, they don't really think part of their role is to train students for jobs.
Yeah.
They think it's to prepare them for the world, to teach them how to learn and unlearn and relearn. So I think that there is a tension between what employers want, which is essentially trained employees, and again, I'm not quite sure even what that means, and then what the purpose of higher education is, which is multiple purposes, right? It's not only to prepare a workforce, it's to prepare a citizenry, and it's also to prepare individuals to get ahead in life.
Yeah.
So there's these multiple purposes, sometimes which have tension with each other, and which is very difficult to do, especially given what you're working with, given the financial realities, and given that we're talking, these are 18-year-olds in many cases.
So, it's not fair to generalize what employers want overall, and you saw a diverse set of responses. What employers generally want is a wonderful and rich workforce that's going to be steady and is going to grow, that incumbent workers are going to be able to grow and have career paths within those environments, and that people have the ability to learn and to innovate, because you saw innovation over a period of time. And that doesn't diminish the importance of liberal arts education or a broader set of knowledge or a richness, a worldliness that's going to be necessary to be a global citizen that comes from a variety of exposures to the classics and other elements of education. The issue is making certain that we enable people to do the work that's necessary as well. And therefore, I think to your previous description, to have a very simple short-term solution within a 4-year package is a big piece of work. And to evolve our system instantaneously to one that's focused specifically on technical output will change the nature of this economy. Germany has a system that's very much focused on technical output with the expectation of a workforce that will be the producers with a dependence on other economies to be the innovators, particularly this one. We obviously want both. And we want to be able to bring both and have a differentiated workforce that is diverse and represents both the real heterogeneity and richness of the population as well as the future choices.
It's interesting when people say, we really want innovative workers. We want people who are entrepreneurial. I totally understand it. The question is, okay, what does that mean? What kind of class or what kind of activity do you sit somebody down in and teach them those skills? Because then you get to the question of like, what was responsible for your success? And almost everybody says my own drive and ambition. I mean, I don't know how you teach that in a class. But how do you teach innovation and entrepreneurship? Is it a class on innovation and entrepreneurship?
I think a class will do nothing by itself. You know, we have something, an edge over other cultures here. And it's the fact that we can fail. And if you fail, you can start again. You know, in other cultures, you know, this is not possible. So what you want is very early on, create opportunities, accelerator opportunities for the students to launch not-for-profits, to launch startups, to launch for-profits, and then to succeed and fail. And the measure of failure is precisely whether it has a leg, it has life. And so what you're doing is creating an ecosystem that allows that to flourish, not only in the classroom, but in the experiential approach, which is, you know, will help you launch the companies, will bring people from outside, will help you launch the not-for-profits that will impact Kenya, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, you have to practice. Let me give you an example. I was talking to the president of a Chinese university, and he said, and it's they opened now a campus in London, about business, and they said to all their students, we're not going to teach you entrepreneurship. And we said, why? I asked him why, and he said, well, because only 1 every 1,000 students are going to be an entrepreneur. But I said, what's your definition of entrepreneur? Launching a company. Entrepreneurship is not only about launching a company. It's a mindset about looking at opportunities that others didn't see and grab them, whether you're working in a large company or are you launching a startup. So that's an edge we have. And you are seeing, once again, higher education has changed. We used to look down at that, saying, why should we go into this? And now every university is saying, we are creating an entrepreneurship ecosystem.
I think that learning how to fail is a critical piece of this. And so to me, it's not about teaching something in a class. It's about creating an environment. And for decades, I think higher education was a great environment to learn how to fail, to experiment and things like that. I mean, one of the problems I have with kind of the increasing consumerism of higher ed is that particularly parents and students wanted everything to be taken care of for them. I had a dean tell me last week, it used to be students would come to us and say, help me solve this problem. And now they come to us and they say, solve this problem for me. And so we've created at most colleges and universities, there's been this huge growth in student support services, you know, everything from advising and in residential life and everything else to help students kind of create safe environments for them. And we don't put them as often as we used to, I think, in unfamiliar situations and just let them figure it out. Within the context of the campus. I mean, it's one of the reasons I love study abroad and what you're doing, particularly with your co-ops overseas, is that you put them in very unfamiliar situations and they have to figure it out. I think that creating that environment and allowing them to fail and figure out why they do, I think undergraduate research, for example, is a strong piece of this as well. You know, I think that those types of environments really help teach that creativity and entrepreneurship that most employers want.
I mean, we've talked a lot about what college isn't doing and what it should be doing and sort of the additions onto things. But I think you alluded to this before, Jeff. We are also facing a situation in which public education, which is overwhelmingly how people get higher ed in this country, is being squeezed financially. And that's not going to end because we see a general wealth transfer right from education to healthcare, sort of beginning of life to end of life. And healthcare I don't see as getting any cheaper anytime soon. Maybe a little bit, but it's still going to get more expensive. So that squeeze on higher education is going to continue. And when you look at private schools, obviously they've gotten more and more expensive, and that is sort of the idea of 10, 15, 20 years of debt that you're working on, you know, while you're, and I think that, you know, delays probably marriage, it delays having kids, it delays getting a house, you know, all those things. So, you know, I guess that is a fundamental question of, we're saying, here are these more things that you need to do. Is there any way that's actually going to happen?
Well, let me tell you, I'm the president of a private university. What worries me the most is the health of the public system. Why? Because 80% of the students in the United States study in public universities. And Massachusetts, from this point of view, is an outlier because we reversed the ratio. But still, you know, every public system has to be preserved and has to be enhanced. Why? Because we live in an environment that is very diverse. If you look at other countries, there is one system, and usually public. And whereas here we have a very healthy culture of collaboration and also of competition. So if overnight the 20% are going to take over and the 80% are going to be weakened, that concerns me. It concerns me not only about education, but also about research. We collaborate and compete with each other constantly. We don't want that. So what we need to do is continue to push for the public system. Because, frankly, the public system is much more diverse than the private. What do I mean by that? You have community colleges, you have state colleges, you have research universities, etc. Whereas, in general, higher education, the privates, are, you know, you have liberal arts colleges and you have research universities, and in between you have very little. And that's not healthy. So that's a worrisome aspect, and it behooves us to push for a healthy public system in Massachusetts and elsewhere.
Yeah,
Gary, as an
well,
employer,
the issue of public funding is critical, and diminution of public funding is imperiling the entire pathway of education. California alone, with the most precious public higher education system in the country, is seeing extraordinary reversal in its ability to invest and thrive because of tremendous budgetary pressures of the last 5 years. And these are among the most magnificent universities really in the world. Simultaneously, the parallel track of research funding imperils the entire pathway, and the realization of many ambitions start to diminish. So, you know, the NIH has essentially been flat funded for the better part of a decade, and in real dollars, NIH funding from 2003 to now is diminished by between 22 and 25%.
National Institutes of Health.
That's, I'm sorry, the National Institutes of Health. That is remarkable, it's striking, and it is the most differentiating feature of American investment relative to the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
And it is another infrastructure that's being abandoned or potentially could be abandoned. We are at Partners through the MGH, the Brigham, McLean, and Spalding, a very substantial recipient of NIH funding and extramural funding of our research. Our extramural funding is about $1.5 billion a year, about half of that coming from federal sources, and the proportion of federal sources has been reduced over a period of time. The average age for a first independent research grant from the NIH is about 44 now. I think it was 41 a couple of years ago. Now it's increased to about 44. And the likelihood of getting one overall, you know, is somewhere between 10 and 15% overall. And in some sectors, 5 or 10%, but between 5 and 10% on an application. That means there's a massive amount of science that is not going to be done, that is essentially being proposed by exceptional people from extraordinary laboratories, and it also creates a hopelessness for entry-level investigators. So we have MD, PhD scientists who are going to pursue their residencies and go into practice. That they may be wonderful practitioners, but the investment in their education was around their driving science and its translation into clinical applications to improve life and to somehow make that healthcare cheaper for those older adults and improve the management of chronic diseases that will be imposed by the aging population.
It's
that
amazing.
is remarkable, and it is a giant threat to the future of higher education and to the society.
I mean, it's remarkable that I'm listening to this because 15 years ago when I started at the Chronicle, I covered the doubling of the NIH budget. And there was so much hope and optimism for the future of higher education and research.
And now we're behind the doubling in real dollars.
Exactly. It's amazing. I never thought I would sit here on this day and hear something like
Kara,
that.
you said, look, one of the responses will be to say, but let companies do the R&D. Companies now cannot afford to do R&D. So, take the mid-sized companies. What we are seeing is that they're coming to universities and saying, we want you to do the R&D with us.
Absolutely.
They don't, they don't have the means to do it. So we, for instance, we are housing a company on our campus where we are doing the R&D for them, and we're not the only ones. Others are doing that. So going back to the point that Gary raised, I think this is a very dangerous situation. Because if you look at our preeminence as a system of higher education, it's based on the fact that our education has been superior and the fact that our research has been superior. So if you start eroding each one, what's left?
And yet, I'll come to you, Jeff, on sort of where you see the reality of this situation going, because exactly as you say, I remember talking to a professor at Brandeis who'd been there a long time, and he basically said, every grant I get, I know that I'm squeezing out some young scientist who could do a really interesting piece of research, but I know how to get the grants, and they're new and they don't. And he knew the system was totally dysfunctional. I remember talking to Bob Langer, who probably has, at MIT, probably has the most patents in the US right now. And he said, Republicans, Democrats, they all agree that not funding the National Institutes of Health is just ruining colleges and universities in that research department. I said, okay, well, they agree. Great, what are we going to do about that? And he just didn't seem to know. I mean, he'd talked to people in Washington, and he felt like, I think he talked to Paul Ryan, and he talked to President Obama, and they agreed, but nothing moves. So, Jeff, anything going to move on that? I mean, are we going to get to a point where some money starts heading back in the direction of higher education, or not really?
I mean, I'm not optimistic. I think, we have a lot of priorities right now, and I think it's, most are going to, certain programs, and obviously there's a revenue issue as well. Yeah. And I think that's probably the biggest difference since the 1990s. But I'm not really confident in either the federal or the state governments in terms of funding, which is incredibly worrisome, because I agree with President Aoun on public education. When I talk to many parents, especially in the Northeast or in the Mid-Atlantic, and especially at more elite publics or private high schools, they're just shocked by this figure that 80% of American students go to public universities. We don't really think of, among certain segments, unfortunately among the influencers in society, think about the New York Times, they rarely ever cover a public university. We don't really think of public universities really being the workhorses of the American economy, but they really are.
So in just a few minutes, we're going to take your questions. So be thinking of questions. You have 2 or 3 minutes. Before we get there, I want to ask you a little bit of a heretical question, probably given who's up here and who's out there. But anyway, is it possible that we're moving in the direction of breaking down the higher education system in some way where people maybe spend less time in higher ed, or maybe they do it piecemeal through their lives? We talk on the show this week to Tom Friedman from the New York Times, and he said kind of an interesting thing, which is that he's worked for the same company for more than 30 years. And he said that will never happen with his daughters. That not only will they have to be very creative about the job they get, but they're going to have to keep getting different jobs throughout their lives. And not only that, probably a good deal of the jobs they get, they're going to have to create those jobs. Either kind of startup things, or within an organization being creative enough to say, hey, what about this? How about we do this? Is it possible, and I'm interested in all of your answers on this, that we're heading towards just a total radical rethinking of what higher education is? And I'll throw one other thing on. If you go interview at Facebook, let's say you want to be an engineer at Facebook, they'll sit you down for 4 or 5 hours of tests. They say, oh, great, you have a degree from Columbia. Okay, sit down at this computer and do some coding, right? Because they have their own tests. And like, they understand Columbia's a good school, but they also want to make sure you pass their tests. And so...
I mean, I think about this a lot. I have a 4-year-old
Yeah.
and a 2-year-old at home, and I always wonder what higher ed and the workforce is going to look like by the time they enter it, you know, at the end of next decade. And I think you're right. Not only will we have multiple jobs and careers in our lifetimes, but we're going to need to access education for each of those, during each of those points. You know, we've been talking about lifelong learning for decades, it seems, but I think the rhetoric has now turned into reality, and it's here. And so this idea of just-in-time learning, you have the foundation, and maybe it's not a 4-year degree that provides that foundation, but every couple of years, every couple of months, you're going to be accessing education, and it won't necessarily be from traditional colleges and universities. You know, it's going to be from the coding academies, the MOOCs. You know, there's a place in Washington that recently opened called General Assembly, which is now in 9 cities and offers courses from a couple of hours to a couple of weeks. And you know, the average age of their student is 25, and is, you know, and 99% of them have graduated from college. But they're accessing education at the moment they need it, whether it's online or in person. So I think that will break apart the degree as we think of it as one place at one time in our lives, and it's much more about a lifelong learning experience.
We had up to now a vertically integrated endeavor. So in higher education, we do research, we do knowledge transmission, teaching, we do assessment, and we do credentialing. This vertical is disappearing and being supplemented now with a horizontal endeavor. Namely, you have outfits doing research and only research. Some are doing the knowledge transmission for free or for a fee. Some are doing the assessment, and the notion of credentialing is being rethought completely. So up to now, we wanted people to come to us. Now we have to go to people. So this customization, the personalization, what are your needs? We're going to provide your needs. And we cannot confine people only to a time frame over a certain number of years, and that's where you learn. Which means that we have to be much more flexible, not only in what we offer, that we have to meet their needs, but also in terms of the deliveries, etc. Something that is very striking to me, 85% of the learners in the nation are non-traditional. What does it mean? That means they cannot go for a full-time education. They already have jobs. They come from different backgrounds. They are executives, non-executives. They are starting from a non-college environment. So what are we doing? You know, all our education, including us, you know, we have focused on the 15%. And this is why, for instance, we are rethinking how can we, in higher education, how can we reach the 85%? And that's the change.
So clearly in professional education on the healthcare delivery side, because of the explosion of biomedical sciences over a period of time, we've created expectations and requirements for lifelong learning. You better hope that we have. And we've created a regulatory environment in which there's recredentialing and more knowledge expected at various professional levels that are also connected to state and other regulatory bodies. And they are less rich than entry-level education, less focused, much more focused on specific skills that relate to those set of specific activities, but nonetheless have progressed over a period of time. I think the challenge in terms of lifelong learning will come really to people who have more challenging lives. I mean, we have a high expectation that of rugged individualism that still remains in this country. That's part of the same harsh environment that's created the policies that are defunding science and education. And for people at greatest need who live in the least stable environments, the notion that they're going to be able to access lifelong education in a way that's going to help them to grow while at the same time living in environments that have a higher degree of uncertainty and safety, being able to manage their families in those circumstances, is disconnected to the vision that this country has put on the table over the past decade or so. And if we're going to have a vision that we're going to enrich the population in the way that Tom Friedman is describing, he wants all of us to be enabled, we better think about resources that are more easily accessible to a broader base of the population, or we're going to have a polarity that is much more extreme than what we're facing now.
Okay, let's take your question. So
I agree.
Put up your hand if you've got a question. I think there are 2 roving mics, and you want to just make sure that the mic reaches you. Here's a question here, that the mic reaches you before you start your question so that everybody can hear it and it's being recorded. And
hello, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, I think so. So very interesting discussion, thank you. I have a question, kind of thinking about the triple helix of education, research, education, industry, and government, because you touched on all of that. And I'm thinking that the metrics of success in each of those areas is a little bit different. So what I'm wondering is, how can we increase and improve the value of research and education and demonstrate that value in terms that make sense to all 3 of those pieces of the triple helix? So in dollars, can we show the value to the economy, the value to society of investing in research, for example, through the NIH, is one example that you brought up. And how can we make those things really obvious so that the research will happen?
I mean, the NIH budget has a multiplier effect, and the number of jobs and dollars that are created for each invested is remarkable. And it's different in different sectors, but the multiplier, is 2.5 times almost every dollar each time in the current NIH budget, and that's because it's been flat. My guess, with a broader degree of participation, it would be a higher level of production. But that argument holds in every discussion one has individually with legislators, but in groups they don't seem to have learned all 3 of those skills that you described before, the communication, social, and working in teams. So that absence of working in teams doesn't seem to take the data, because this whole entire survey is about the economy, right? I mean, it's all about job participation, the success of companies, because it's CEOs, and the societal measure of that success being a economy and a more productive society. And those data don't seem to always be convincing for whatever reason.
So
they are long, because they're long-run data. I mean, the ROI of high-speed rail is like the ROI of higher education. It's not in the immediate quarter. It has a continuous productive effect and a catalytic effect on an economy that continues to grow.
So maybe we need better communications in that area.
Better listeners.
Both.
I was sitting at a dinner one time next to a guy who was a researcher at DARPA, which is the defense's arm of research, and he was just griping the whole time about how they're cutting the defense research project. We wouldn't have the internet if it wasn't for DARPA. So it's hard to say. I don't know. I feel like we maybe have the proof that these things work, but anyway. Other questions? There are 2 right here.
Hello, my name is Mark Johnson. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Harvard School of Education, and my research focuses on college trustees. And I have a question that I'd like to direct to Mr. Gottlieb, and it's around your comment on companies doing a better job kind of communicating to institutions their needs, particularly around these perceptions of there being a skills gap. But in my conversations with trustees, the issues that they are raising don't concern the workforce. They're around revenue generation, teaching and learning opportunities via kind of non-traditional platforms, I don't know, remediation. And so, I wonder kind of, is it that they don't know that this perception exists, or is it simply not a priority in kind of the eyes of the institutions? And if it's a matter of not knowing, kind of what exactly can companies do to communicate this concern to them? Because in many cases, these C-suite executives are actually sitting on these trustee boards. And so one would imagine that they would kind of translate those concerns into those conversations.
It is interesting, and I think that very often we respond to questions with those issues that feel most immediate and most pressing, as opposed to the vision of the institutions or the organizations that we're working in. I would suggest to you the differentiation of the Massachusetts or Boston-related workforce in these polls is related to talent and access to talent and close proximity to institutions of extraordinary higher learning for the better part of a couple of centuries. And that's a leverage that being in this environment has had for us. You know, and to not see that is really speaking to the short term rather than the long term. So I think that those are very wise people, but they're probably responding to the highest degree of pressure, because everyone will describe the values of their organization around their people, and they will all say or pay lip service and truly believe that the most important asset are the people who work in the institution. Without an understanding of what those people will need to be 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 15 years from now, we're not providing the appropriate data to those institutions that we need to partner with to be able to create those pipelines for us. We're just guessing or hoping or believing we'll be so strong we can pluck them from elsewhere on the earth. And that's, you know, that will be very expensive. I'd really much rather have magnificent people walk from Roxbury into the Brigham and Women's Hospital, or from Charlestown into the MGH, and be immediately enabled with all the skills in and around that area. That will be much less expensive, and it'll create the opportunity for the greatest possible growth. And we need to be able to see that at the same time as plucking the best people from the face of the earth and bringing them here.
There's another question just a couple rows back.
I'm Michelle Whalen. I'm Chief Academic Officer for Emerson College. And I'm interested in the survey focus on preparing students to be innovators. And I guess my question is, how does higher education nurture creativity? And should we be thinking about the role of the arts in preparing entrepreneurs or for a creative economy?
You raised two questions. And let me start with the second one about the role of the arts. Absolutely. I mean, why should you exclude the arts? I completely agree with you. The other one is in terms of how do we prepare students. But frankly, you know, we talked a little bit about it. You know, you have an ecosystem of innovation, entrepreneurship, failure, etc. But what's interesting is that the question that also we need to ask ourselves as, you know, people in charge of universities, and you're in charge of the university, is, are we doing the same at our level? Are we managing the university in an innovative way, in an entrepreneurship entrepreneurial way? And the answer is often no. Going back, if I may, to your question, you picked on the trustees, and I would not pick on the trustees. The trustees are part of the institution, you know, and therefore your question is, why is it the case that sometimes you ignore reality? And because sometimes we have the luxury of ignoring reality. You start being in touch with reality when you have anxiety. When you have anxiety and you wonder whether your institution is going to survive 15 years from now, 50 years from now. And so it's not only the trustees, it's all the people who are involved, who are entrusted with the future of the university. And frankly, it is very uneven. So you're seeing small liberal arts colleges that are in trouble financially, that are waking up and saying, we cannot do it in the same way. Why? It's anxiety. It's fear of not surviving. And therefore, you know, it's not the trustees, it's not management, it's not the administrators. Are we in a situation where, for instance, our endowment, the number of students coming, preventing us from looking at the reality? And in many cases, in some cases it is nationwide, and in some other cases you're seeing innovation happening.
I mean, as a son of a musician, I 100% agree with the role creativity plays. Unfortunately, I think sometimes higher ed, it's too late, right? I look at my 4-year-old and look how creative she is, and I just fear that once she gets into school, all that will be kind of washed away, right? So I think that it has more to do, especially with early childhood and elementary education more than anything. And I think that by the time students get to higher ed, it may in some ways be too late. So I think that if we focus anywhere, it should be at the much lower level.
So I would argue a little bit, because I was reminded by your comment before. I think the key to for us to find innovators is to introduce all of them to Bob Langer, because there are enablers somehow in our faculty and in our businesses and in our community. There are people who show other people that they can do almost anything. And he's the kind of person who can show scientists who are focusing on very, very basic sets of principles that their ideas can be translated into magnificent changes in the human condition. And I mean, in a way that's truly breathtaking. He's not just legendary for his patents, it's for the number of people he's mentored who have grown into being very special in their own right. And the only safe ground for those people are institutions of higher learning, because their requirements are less clear. Their requirements are around that creativity and their generativity, and you know, great university. No,
I was most worried about the role of the arts.
I got it. Yeah. Well, and also I want to thank her for rebuilding our city's arts, which is one of a great college has helped to reinvigorate the arts in this city, and rebuilding an entire neighborhood of arts. So
on this, if I may, with respect to what Gary said, we are going to see, and we are seeing the onset of that with NIH, being stable, etc. We're seeing a phenomenon of winner takes all. So you have a concentration of research powerhouses, and they are going to be the ones, we're going to be the ones taking over. And that's worrisome. Well, it's worrisome because in many ways, other institutions are going to be left out. So you're seeing an enormous stratification in terms of education and an enormous stratification in terms of research. And, the diversity is disappearing and it's more a concentration. Now, Boston, from this perspective, is very well positioned, paradoxically, because we have such a large concentration and we are collaborating. We can collaborate more with the eds, the meds, etc. But that's happening. So this stratification is, you can see Boston as being a stratum and the others being left out in some places. But that's what's happening.
And it's not only the institutions, it's the students who are left out too. I mean,
absolutely.
We had, only about 66% of high school graduates last year enrolled in college, one of the lowest in the last couple of years. We know that higher ed completion and degree is very closely tied to income, more tied to income than ever before. And so what really worries me is that not only are we producing a country of have and have-nots among institutions, but then that is producing a country of have and have-nots among education.
A few more questions out here. Just raise, one's right there.
I'm Ann Coles from U Aspire. My question is, given that we are rapidly becoming a majority-minority nation and struggling with persistent achievement gaps between majority and minority students, particularly African American and Latino, what kinds of innovative strategies do you see on the horizon to help address and close this gap, which is critical for us to do to maintain our viable global position?
Would like to start. Shall I start? Jeff, start. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, I'll follow.
One of the more interesting things to me is around the gap between high school and higher education. I think the problem right now in this country is that when you graduate, if you graduate from high school, but when you graduate from high school, you have very few choices about what to do next, right? You could go to the military, you get a job and not a very good one. You could live at home, and for most people that's not an option, or you go to college. And I think what ends up happening is that 400,000 students drop out of college every year. Many of them are just simply not prepared to go to college at 18. That doesn't necessarily mean they shouldn't go to college at all, and I worry about that narrative of don't go to college. But one thing I am seeing, and there's a program that's launching right now in Baltimore, for example, of a gap year for all. The gap year used to be thought of as something rich kids do by going to Europe and traveling around, but this idea is really trying to bring some of the stuff we were talking about today. Real skill sets, money to pay for college, and even college credit. And I think it's programs like that that allow students who are not quite sure what they want to do, or that even higher education is for them, to have a sense of the possibilities. And I think that we need to create more bridge programs so that when students graduate from college, they see a broader array of options available to them. And it doesn't mean that they won't get a college degree, but this idea that we have to go to college at 18 and we have to finish in 2 or 4 years, I think is really an image of a country that from 20 or 30 years ago.
Look, in higher education, we measure our success by the number of people we exclude from college. So, for instance, we say, in my own institution, we receive 50,000 applications for 2,800 seats. So what do? We exclude most of them. Now, if you are quantifying your success based on exclusion, you're excluding people left and right. Now, so what can be done? There are programs that every institution can launch. Let me give you an example. We have something called Boston Foundation Year, where we take students who do not, from the Boston public schools, who do not qualify for college. And what we do, we give them, education for a year, and afterwards, they move into Northeastern, or we place them in other colleges. Now, if you imagine that each university and each college has a program like that, then we are scaling up the opportunities. In some ways, we have opportunities. Each one of us has opportunities to launch programs, and we have opportunities to learn from each other about that. That's what's happening, and it's an obligation we have. The other aspect that is very important is that we look down nationwide. I'm not talking about here, at community colleges also. We underinvest in community colleges, and the transfer system for between community colleges nationwide. I'm not talking about Massachusetts specifically. The transfer system between community colleges and universities or other aspects or other institutions has been dismal, and we need to work on that.
In both comments, the question is, how do we ease the pathway from secondary education, make sure that the foundation is firm enough, and then allow the uncertainty of the next step, which is the first step in adult life, for people who may be first college goers in their families, who are dealing with higher degrees in likelihood, and this is not a pan-ethnic issue, but you're really focusing on sociodemography as well. So a higher degree of uncertainty in terms of safety within a neighborhood, resources to be able to navigate the strangeness of paying bills in college, which come about every 5 weeks, and be able to meet all of a subset of requirements that only very savvy people or families who have experience in managing these pathways can be able to be able to do. We're both very fortunate to participate in a program here in Boston that really came from Mayor Menino's vision called Success Boston, that is really focused on giving a set of individual attention and providing both coaching and a variety of other elements to pay that kind of attention for every step that Boston public school students have, to make certain that, one, there's a higher traction rate for the first couple of years, and make certain that even if it takes a longer period of time, there is a success associated with that. And there's starting to be some traction, but it requires a high degree of focused attention in an ongoing way to help that transition to occur. It's a great investment the Boston Foundation has made in this, and really a model that I'm hoping will be generalizable.
It's interesting, too, about having that kind of gap year, because I think in a lot of ways it makes you, as a student, think about, and being thrown into the work world, think about, do I really want to be in higher education, and be motivated when you get there. I mean, we've had a whole panel about college education, and we haven't mentioned drinking, which, probably to college students would seem crazy, but I always noticed the difference between the 25-year-old student who was paying their own way and who really wanted to be there, and the 19-year-old who wasn't quite sure what they were doing there, but somebody had driven them and dropped them off. And, and so I think, but that gap year can help clarify.
I mean, in some ways, some colleges become warehouses for students, because we don't know at 18, because we don't know what else to do with them.
That's right.
From the time they're adolescents to the time they're to adults.
Look, in some ways also, to have the experiential approach forces you to be sober. Absolutely. And here
it's the best medicine. There was a question right here.
In the result that a lot of the CEOs attributed...
we're not hearing well. Could you get it closer?
Yes, sorry.
Yes.
Not used to microphones. I was interested in the result that CEOs attributed more of their success to hard work and motivation and ambition rather than the college education. And I can't help but think that that's related to the move of especially public higher education from a public good to a private good, and thinking about the role that we attribute our own success to these what were civic institutions. And I'm just wondering if you would mind commenting on whether higher education as we knew it is going to continue to be a part of the American dream in a way, or are we watching kind of the disentanglement of this institution from the new American future?
Jeff, you wrote so much about that.
You're a writer.
Well, so there's this great movie coming out in a couple of months from the people who made Waiting for Superman called Ivory Tower, and it kind of traces the history of American higher education post-World War II. And my big takeaway from this movie is that, you know, we had the GI Bill, we had the Higher Education Act, we really thought big about higher ed. And now I'm probably going to offend half the room. But it was the baby boomers who really benefited from that. And now, over the last decade plus, as the baby boomers particularly were in leadership positions, we've kind of switched the contract we've had with our citizens around higher education as a public good. And I really worry that, you know, it used to be that you could go essentially in California college for free. When I lived in North Carolina just 15 years ago, you could go to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, one of the best public universities in the country, for a couple $1,000s a year. And now for so many families, I grew up in Northeastern Pennsylvania. I graduated in a high school class where 50% of kids didn't go to college. There's actually fewer kids now going to college than when I graduated from high school, from that same high school. I mean, it should just be the opposite, right? And for them, many of their parents didn't go to college. It just seems so far away. And I think it's because we have moved from this idea of higher education as a public good, and it really worries me. And I blame partly this generation that benefited from a higher education system that was very good to them. Sorry for, I don't blame everyone, but.
No, my immediate response is not as a CEO, but as a psychiatrist. It's narcissism. Everybody answers it. It's my hard work, it's everything I do.
Let me, along the same lines, what worries me is that public higher education is privatizing. What does it mean? It means that essentially the mission of public higher education nationwide was to focus on getting the students in the state to have an education. Now we are seeing a race in public higher education where the institutions nationwide are chasing the paying students from out of state and the international students. That's typically what private institutions have done. And therefore, the taxpayer at some point is going to wake up and saying, why am I supporting that if my daughter or my son doesn't have, they don't have an opportunity to get into a public college? That's worrisome. And that's what Jeff was talking about. That worries me tremendously.
We can take one or two more questions. So there is one way back there, and there's one right here. Sorry, we've got a bunch of hands up.
Good morning, and thank you for a wonderful discussion. My name is Paula Paris. I am with an organization called JFY Networks, another nonprofit working in the transition from high school to college space. I really would like to follow up on the success measures for college, and I don't think it's something that comes as a surprise, but it's a startling statement that success is for college is one of the success measures is the number of people excluded. The public higher education system, at least the community colleges, there has been money allocated now to try to improve the throughput rate and perhaps the transfer rate, which have not previously been looked at as success measures. In workforce development programs, the measures of success are how many people you have trained and put into the workforce, so how the measure of people hired. So with this misalignment of success measures, how would you approach a real pipeline, so for real people to get from point A to whatever the end point is, which is meaningful employment and a healthy economy for employers. Thank you.
Jeff, look, your point is extremely well taken. And what we are seeing, and this is what's unique about the American university system, is that this diversity that we have is allowing innovation to happen. So, for instance, up till now, we focused on input measures. And rightly so, we need to also start thinking beyond the input measures on output measures. By the time the students leave, are they ready for life? Are they ready for success? And you are seeing experiments now happening, like something called competency-based learning, meaning that we don't care about your grades, we don't care what you know. What we care is by the time you leave, what you have studied, what you have learned, are you ready for X, Y, and Z? So let's not assume that American higher education is monolithic. You mentioned that, Jeff. It is not. And we are seeing that this, with the wake-up calls that we are witnessing, that people are stepping up and looking at new ways of rethinking higher education, and it's about time.
I think we're moving on this. I think the U.S. News rankings and all types of rankings have really driven higher education to think about those input measures for the last couple of decades. And I think now with the introduction of real good analysis of data, we're starting to look much more at outcomes. And particularly right now, which is a little worrisome, we're looking at employment outcomes. Are people employed and how much they're making, and able to now track that back to specific institutions and specific majors. If that's the only outcome of higher education, that really worries me, because we know that higher education is much more than just about getting a job. But if higher ed does a good job at defining what the outcomes of institutions should be, and I'm not quite sure they can figure that out, but if they can figure that out and start measuring it, I think within the next 10 years, we will see a different kind of rankings, not based on inputs, but based on what colleges are actually producing. And by the way, I think we might see the rankings flip a little bit. I think we might see new institutions enter the top 10 that were never there, because they're actually producing great graduates who are going on not only to do great work in the economy, but do great things in their communities.
And a final question.
Hi, I'm Colleen Flynn. I work at GBH, but I'm also an AmeriCorps alum. And I wanted to know whether or not business leaders see any value in public service programs like City Year, Code for America, Lyft, Health Leads in preparing college graduates for the workforce, and whether higher education feels any responsibility or role in creating that pipeline.
Well, those are formal programs that do a lot of essential work and bring special people to the workforce, and also, frankly, have those organizations to help to support them, using their experience, their knowledge, the support of that individual to be able to help them to succeed in areas that might be more difficult. The classroom I am certain that you probably taught in was an exceptional challenge for an experienced teacher. So for a young teacher to walk into that environment and to have the organizational support obviously increase the probability of your being able to succeed. And similar programs, certainly City Year is superb in being able to create that experiential opportunity, and those organizations provide tremendous value.
For the second half of your question, how do we educators look at it? And let me tell you that something very healthy is happening in higher education, and I'm talking about higher education in general, that the demand for service engagement, service learning is at an all-time high. When we think that people want to go to Wall Street, after this recession, you have an enormous demand for service engagement. And you know what? It's very difficult to get into Teach for America. Why? Because the demand exceeds the supply. That's not very healthy. It is great, and as Gary said, this is experiential education.
Great, thank you very much. This was a wonderful panel, wonderful discussion. Thanks very much to all of you for coming. And I pass it back to you for a closing comment here?
Yes, they want me to move here for the camera, so I don't know what that means. But first of all, let me thank Kara and Jeff and Gary for a great discussion. Thank you. I also would like to thank WGBH and the New England Council and also the leaders of our survey. You did a magnificent job. Thank you. Let's give them another round of applause. You know, what's next? We did it. You know, you came here, you looked at the survey, you heard from the panelists, and now the question is there life after today? So what are we going to do together? You know, Boston is a great hub for education. It's a great hub for innovation. And what we would like to do, we're going to continue with the surveys every year and look at the different aspects. But there are many things we can do together, and this city, this great city, has the largest concentration of colleges, universities, and hospitals, research hospitals. So one of the questions, no university can be self-sufficient. No matter how large its endowment or how great its research, no university can do that on its own. The hospitals learn that very early on because they are very open to collaboration at all levels. Now, we have examples of that, but those are examples that are more the exception. Like, for instance, we created a consortium for high-performance computing involving Harvard, MIT, Northeastern, BU, the UMass system. Why? Because we realized that no one should do it on its own, and no one can do it on its own. The question is, what can we do together to ensure that this great city is going to be the great city of the future and will be the magnet that it has been, ranging from the arts to the scientific research. We have a lot to do. So what you are seeing today here is the beginning of a conversation. Stay tuned. We want you to be engaged in it. And thank you all for coming. Thank you. Thank you, Karen.